The astrology for the years of 2025 and 2026 promise dramatic change on both the world stage and in our personal lives. And we've certainly already been experiencing that in dramatic ways this year. But this next week on May 24th, when Saturn enters the sign of Aries, we will be crossing the threshold into another layer, another stage in the process of this great change that we know is coming. One of the reasons we've known so much change will be coming this year is because of the number of outer, slow moving planets changing signs. We've already had Neptune change signs into Aries. And later this year, we will have Jupiter enter Cancer in June and Uranus enter Gemini in July. Those are going to be the last final two pieces of all the great planetary sign changes that we'll be experiencing this year. But this one coming on May 24th, when Saturn moves from Pisces into Aries, is especially notable. One reason is simply the fact that we are talking about Saturn. Saturn is the outermost planet that we can see with our eye consistently. It is that superior planet of the outer limits, that planet standing at the threshold between the visible planets and the invisible realm beyond, that planet that signifies form as well as formlessness, time as well as timelessness. And we know when we follow astrology that the transit of Saturn is one of the most powerful to track in both our personal lives as well on the world stage. And so, because Saturn is the slowest moving of the visible planets, when it changes signs, we see dramatic changes happen in the world around us. Now, if you are curious about the meaning of this change of Saturn into Aries in your personal life, I would recommend booking an astrology consultation. My books are open right now for June, and you can book a session with me. I'll put a link below in this description so you can book an astrology consultation with me. You really do need to look at your own natal chart to understand the meaning of Saturn changing signs. One reason there is a big change with Saturn moving from Pisces into Aries is that there is a dramatic difference between the signs of Pisces and Aries. Pisces is an inwardly directed water sign that is very imaginative, very creative, very intuitive, but slower moving, more internal. And that slower movement and process of Pisces, that greater internality of Pisces and imagination of Pisces has accentuated the ponderousness and slow moving intuitive spiral of Saturn in Pisces. It's increased the ability to perhaps fantasize and imagine creative ideas or solutions, but it's also increased that internal, slow moving quality of Saturn even more. And as we move from the slow moving water sign of Pisces into this fast, fiery, initiating sign of Aries, it is a dramatic difference. And that fiery, fast moving quality of Aries is paradoxical for Saturn because remember, Saturn is slow. Saturn ponders things. Saturn contemplates things. Saturn likes to build a solid foundation. Saturn can be cautious and conservative and incredibly imaginative with its ability to imagine a new world and take all the steps needed to lay the foundation to build and create that world. But Saturn needs to take time in doing that. And so with Aries, we have this contrast between the meaning of the planet and the living symbolism of that sign because Aries likes to move fast. Aries instinctually will leap into action. Aries can get a sense of what Aries wants to create and go after and will leap and rush into that. And the difficulty with that with Saturn is that there's not always as much thought into the full ramifications and the full consequences of those actions in the way that Saturn likes to really take its time when we get into that faster, fiery, initiating type of quality of Aries. Saturn also possesses a binding quality that can hold form together and allow us to develop long term relationships, long term structures, long term forms that will endure and persist and age with time and continue to get better with time. Things about Saturn take time and they tend to get better with time. Now, this can still happen with Saturn in Aries, but Aries has more of that quality of disrupting the order, bringing something new in, creating change. And so this again creates more of a paradoxical situation for Saturn in Aries. And as I'll talk a little bit more about, the most paradoxical thing of all about Saturn in Aries is that Aries is the fall of Saturn. That's because the exaltation of Saturn is in Libra, and the exaltation of the sun is in Aries. And so we are putting Saturn in the sign that exalts the sun. The sun is the center of our solar system. It's that star at the center of everything that radiates light, that gives us life. Aries in the northern hemisphere is that point of the spring equinox and increasing light and new life emerging. And of course, that fiery quality of Aries that brings life and arouses action and inspires us to take action and create in the world exalts that solar quality of the sun that can cohere our purpose together and focalize our will through our work and actions and creativity. In contrast, Saturn is exalted in Libra. Libra in the northern hemisphere is that point of the fall equinox when we start getting a decrease of light and night increases and we transition into the fall and the winter and the death that will bring forth the regeneration and rebirth of spring. And so that increasing darkness quality of Libra in the northern hemisphere goes with the darkness of Saturn being exalted in Libra. We can also think about the great intellectual capacities of Libra, Libra's ability to contemplate and measure and discriminate and think through the aesthetics and the relationships and the many interrelationships in decision making. And so these are qualities that contemplative, ponderous nature of Saturn resonates with. And so these are some of the reasons why then Saturn is exalted in Libra. Now, as I start talking here about Saturn having its fall in Aries, it is important to keep in mind that if you have Saturn in Aries in your chart, there is a lot more nuance in terms of how you live your life and experience that planet and what can develop over time. For example, people that have planets in fall, such as Saturn in Aries, might be facing certain challenges or adversity related to that placement, but it also at the same time becomes that type of force of adversity or challenge, which becomes essential to the great work and purpose that they develop in their life. And so that's again why you really need to have a astrology consultation to talk about it. But there is a sense of meaning that we can talk about collectively of experiencing Saturn in its fall in Aries. This is going to be very different to what we experienced years ago when Saturn was in Capricorn in 2019 and 2020, and when Saturn was in Aquarius in 2021 and 2022. That was Saturn in its home signs, directly expressing itself in the world. And so Saturn in its fall of Aries, in contrast, will have less of that ability to bind and hold and sort of enforce a particular order. We're going to experience more of an unraveling, more of an unbinding in systemic structures. And while this is going to bring challenges, this is going to make us have to face adversity. It's also going to create the opportunity for new movement, new change. And that is going to be the thing we need to embrace and just have a sense of wisdom about how we go about creating that change in our own personal lives with what we are able to manage and set into motion. However, the biggest reason the entrance of Saturn into Aries is so important is the fact that Neptune is already in Aries at the beginning of Aries, awaiting Saturn. This is a chart for Saturn entering Aries on May 24th, 2025, set for Washington, D.C. So in Eastern time, this is happening around 11:35 p.m., making it about 8:35 p.m. if you're in Pacific time. But if you're in a different time zone, this could be happening on May 25th, for example, instead of May 24th. We can see here when Saturn enters Aries that Neptune is at 1 degree and 43 minutes of Aries. And so as soon as this happens, not only are they in the same zodiac sign again, they are now less than 2 degrees away from each other. And so we will have this intensified meaning of Saturn and Neptune that although we've already been feeling this and sensing it and experiencing change related to Saturn and Neptune in the past year, and especially in the past 4 months or so, this is going to be a more intensified version of Saturn and Neptune that we've experienced so far. And Saturn and Neptune will continue to get closer and closer together in Aries until they both station retrograde in July. And when Saturn stations retrograde on July 13th of 2025, it'll be at 1 degree and 56 minutes of Aries, with Neptune only at 2 degrees and 9 minutes of Aries. So they will be so close together that it is going to feel very much like a conjunction and like this new era of Saturn and Neptune taking shape. When Saturn and Neptune come together, collective notions of reality bend. We have a new sense of reality that tends to start to emerge. There is a dissolution and a dissolving of the ways things have been. Like we've already this year been experiencing various geopolitical alliances changing and shifting and ending. That's very typical for Saturn and Neptune. And as we know, we are in a time of great technological change and innovation. That is also typical for Saturn and Neptune. The fact is, though, that they are not going to exactly come together this year. It's not going to actually happen until February 20th of 2026. And so that is one thing about the entrance of Saturn into Aries to keep in mind. We are going to have some new sense of Saturn emerge this year, along with Neptune in that fiery sign of Aries that's all about creating change. But later in the year, both Saturn as well as Neptune are going to come back into Pisces, and we're not going to actually fully completely initiate this new cycle of Saturn and Neptune until February of 2026. And so Saturn will come back into Pisces on September 1st. And so whatever gets set into motion now with Saturn into Aries, keep in mind that later in the year, Saturn will come back into Pisces and we will still have final lessons to be gaining with Saturn in Pisces from September 1st until February 13th of 2026. At the same time, Neptune will be in Aries until about October 22nd of 2025, when Neptune will also come back to Pisces. Neptune will be in Pisces in November, in December, and for most of January until Neptune comes back into Aries on January 26th. And so then once Saturn comes back into Aries on February 13th of 2026, they will be very close together. And by the end of February, we will have that new conjunction. Saturn will then start to move away from Neptune, but they will remain in the same sign all the way until April of 2028, at which point Saturn will finally leave the sign of Aries. And so the storylines and the changes that will be taking shape in your life as soon as Saturn enters into Aries, these are things that are going to be playing out all the way until April of 2028. This is one of the reasons why it's such a significant time. But that conjunction of Saturn and Neptune makes it a much bigger deal and much more important than normal. As I mentioned, when Saturn and Neptune come together, we tend to get a warping and a bending of reality and what people agree reality is. There's often big breakthroughs in thought, and we might need to be prepared for some big scientific breakthroughs in theories or spirituality or other much larger collective changes that start dramatically shifting the way people in large mass bodies of collective groupings start shifting and changing. Again, this is not so much even in this way on a personal level. You'll be going through your own individual changes, but because of the history we see with Saturn and Neptune, we know that collectively there's going to be large collective changes. And with Saturn and Neptune, it tends to often sweep people up into collective identities and collective change. And that's part of the tension because Saturn, of course, is more solitary and individual. And so we will be going through our own individual metamorphosis and transmutations and changes. But there will also be that collective notion of Neptune that can lift us up into collective identities, and we might be swept up within larger movements of change. And so that's going to be something to also keep track of. How are you being swept up into a collective fervor? How are you being swept up by the spirit of the times? This is especially going to be the case with Aries, with this inspirational, fiery sign of movement and change. We can see on this particular slide here just some of the ways Saturn and Neptune have this contrasting meaning and how that limits and conditional constraints, that certainty of consequences, form, and boundaries of Saturn gets set against that ideal of Neptune, that limitless possibility that also brings the uncertainty of possibility. And that is certainly something we've all been experiencing in one way or another this year already. The great uncertainty that happens during Saturn and Neptune time periods is something that's going to be important to keep in mind as Saturn comes in to Aries, because both Saturn and Neptune have different ways of dealing with the uncertainty. So much has been moving and changing so quickly already in 2025. And because the astrological cycles suggest even faster moving changes will be on the way this year, we need to come into relationship with that type of fear and uncertainty that might be coming up because of all the changes going on, whether that's because of economic reasons or because of old systems of support or structures no longer being there or no longer being as reliable. These Saturn and Neptune time periods necessitate going into and leaning into the uncertainty in ways that can cultivate inner faith. We need to go within to our own inner knowing in these time periods and trust the inner knowing that we can cultivate through faith in the unknown. Although we can expect difficulty and challenges on the way with Saturn and Neptune in Aries, they are an incredibly powerful combination in Aries for changing your life and for building your dream. The thing about Aries, of course, though, is thinking again about the consequences of your dream. Because with Saturn and Neptune, that concept of manifest destiny is very potent. In the United States of America, the term manifest destiny was first written down in 1845 when Saturn and Neptune were both in the sign of Aquarius and approaching their next conjunction a few years later. And so, while manifest destiny and building your dream can sound very positive when you're constructing that vision, we do want to keep in mind the consequences on others, because there can also be here a sense of what you particularly think is the right way to be that then becomes enforced on others. And this can be especially difficult and tricky with Saturn and Neptune when we come to our ideals and building that idealized vision. Because unfortunately, although Saturn and Neptune can be very powerful for building your ideals and building your dreams, people can also start wanting to enforce their ideals on other people and persecuting other people based upon ideals. At the same time, Saturn and Neptune can bring great epiphanies and great spiritual realizations and self realization. There's also been a consistent pattern throughout history of inquisitions and witch hunts and persecuting others based upon beliefs in one way or another. Yet at the same time, if you've had a dream that you've been working on building and inspired to bring into the world and create change and leave the way things have been for you to break into a more enlivening life full of greater creative vitality, the Saturn Neptune time period in Aries is going to be extraordinarily powerful to make that happen. Now, symbolically, we can think about the sign of Aries as being the first sign in the zodiac, and so it corresponding with new beginnings and this new era. But the reason that I personally practice the tropical zodiac, although I do think the sidereal zodiac, based upon where the constellations are in the sky, is very powerful and meaningful, I predominantly use the tropical zodiac because of the way 0 degrees of Aries lines up with the spring equinox in the northern hemisphere or the fall equinox in the southern hemisphere, and the fact that in the tropical zodiac, 0 degrees of Aries marks the world axis. This is that point of the intersection between the celestial equator. If we project that equator of the Earth out into space and where it intersects with the zodiac belt, that apparent path of the sun, even though, of course, we're orbiting around the sun, it appears that the sun is going around us. From our perspective, that movement and path of the sun defines the ecliptic and the zodiac belt. And so that intersection of the ecliptic and the celestial equator is at 0 degrees of Aries. And when the sun hits that point of 0 degrees of Aries, we have the incredible phenomenon of equal day and night, equal light and darkness all around the world. It's an actual, very tangible point of manifestation that we can all feel visibly, viscerally in the world around us. And so when planets hit this 0 degree point of Aries in the tropical zodiac, they come into this more intensified presence of manifestation. And so a Saturn and Neptune conjunction so close to 0 degrees of Aries is really the most powerful one possible, just in terms of pure potential and pure impact. And so that is the reason why astrologers have been so fascinated by what will actually happen in 2025 and 2026. And because this is so rare for Saturn and Neptune to come together at this 0 degrees of Aries point, it really creates an unprecedented circumstance. We haven't had something this close to 0 degrees of Aries since 4361 BC. You have to go back thousands and thousands of years to have one like this. Plus, at the same time, we've had Pluto change signs recently into Aquarius. We are going to have Uranus change signs into Gemini, and we're going to have these harmonious aspects between Pluto, Uranus, and Saturn and Neptune, all in these new signs. And so that creates this powerful matrix of incredibly powerful change that is on the way. Another reason I think this is so powerful is due to a quadruplicity sequence that I've noticed occurs with Saturn and Neptune conjunctions. Saturn and Neptune will come together every 35 to 36 years, and they will form conjunctions in signs of the same quadruplicity 2 or 3 times in a row. And so there will be a sequence of Saturn and Neptune forming conjunctions in cardinal signs 2 or 3 times, and then shifting into mutable signs 2 or 3 times, then shifting into fixed signs, and then shifting back into cardinal signs. And as far as I can tell, this goes back as a pattern, again, thousands and thousands of years. You have to go back into BC. I haven't gone completely that far back, but if you go at least centuries into BC, you'll see this pattern holding. And so, because cardinal signs are the initiating signs, I have just developed my own astrological theory. I'm sort of testing out that the cardinal signs of Saturn and Neptune could be especially powerful for initiating larger scale eras of collective changes in reality. And so the Saturn and Neptune conjunction is also powerful because it is the final cardinal sign conjunction we will have in a sequence that began in 1952 and 1953 when we had these Saturn Neptune conjunctions in Libra. Since then, we had one in 1989 in Capricorn, and we'll have the one in 2026 in Aries. The next time we have a Saturn and Neptune conjunction will not be until 2061. That will be in Gemini, and it will lead into a mutable phase of Saturn and Neptune conjunctions. When you look at this chart and just see the different time periods of the cardinal sign conjunctions, one thing that leaps out to me about it is when we look at that 1380 to 1450 time period. This is a time period of a lot of the Renaissance developments going on, which was a very notable change in collective meaning. And then when we get to the next phase of cardinal signs in 1667 to 1773, this overlaps in significant ways with the age of enlightenment, which then led into increasing colonization, increasing industrial revolutions, and to the point that by the time we got to the end of that cardinal sign sequence, it then shifted into the mutable signs, it then shifted into the fixed signs. In that fixed sign era, we had these great world wars. And the cardinal sign sequence that we've been having since 1952 to 1953 came after those world wars. And there was a Cold War that developed between the United States and the Soviet Union at that 1952 conjunction that then had a shift in that power dynamic in the 1989 conjunction in Capricorn when the Soviet Union dissolved. Now we are seeing all these geopolitical alignments that emerged after World War II in a state of flux. and change. There's been a general pattern of increasing globalization that is also now being tested with new movements of nationalism and some changes coming in with different trade wars and so on. We can also see that since this cardinal sign sequence have begun, we've had increasing ways of technology bringing us together in more interconnected and collective ways. The television era was really launched at that 1952 to 1953 conjunction, being able to watch things collectively all around the world at the same time. The way different television shows started creating more collective senses of identity that different people all the way around the world could be influenced by. It also created new ways for greater propaganda. And at that 1989 conjunction, we had the World Wide Web coming in. And again, even more interconnectivity developing since that time, and the power of the internet, which has also, of course, had even more extreme propaganda and manipulation, even beyond what was happening with the television era. That's also come into effect since then. And so when we talk about propaganda and manipulation and illusion and delusion, these are things that people associate with the meaning of Neptune. But it's also important to keep in mind that Saturn traditionally also has to do with deception. And the deception of Saturn can be the most tricky of all, because we can think with the sense of Saturn that we know the truth, or that our beliefs or our ideals are the correct ones. And we can then take effort to control those, or try to control other people, or persecute other people whose beliefs we do not think are, the way things should be. And so there is this sense of persecution as well as delusion and illusion that will be alive with Saturn and Neptune, and we do need to be careful about. However, that is not the only story with Saturn and Neptune. Saturn and Neptune can also bring about great awakenings. And Neptune can make that limited sense of Saturn perception at times open to the greater possibility of what is beyond the limits and constraints of that framework of perception that Saturn is bringing into reality. And consistently across time, Saturn Neptune conjunctions have aligned with great insights into other dimensions of reality, that invisible realm of meaning connected to Neptune coming in and making us aware of what we were not realizing about the deeper layers of reality. And there is so much going on with that right now, all the way around the world, that it is one of the things that I am truly fascinated about what could emerge with the Saturn and Neptune combination in Aries. I think we can certainly expect there likely could be new spiritual movements, new religious movements, scientific breakthroughs that completely alter our conception of reality. We also know that there is going to be great technological innovation, because technology right now is accelerating at such a rapid pace. And this is something that we can also see consistently with Saturn and Neptune, as well as with Saturn in Aries. And so every time Saturn is in Aries, it is not forming a conjunction with Neptune. There is some sense of what happened before with Saturn in Aries that we can think about in relation to what might happen with Saturn in Aries combining with Neptune in Aries. The last time Saturn was in Aries was roughly the years of 1996 to 1999. And so I mentioned how the World Wide Web and the internet started developing following that Saturn and Neptune conjunction in Capricorn in 1989. This Saturn and Aries period in the late 90s was a real acceleration into that internet era. And we had that big internet boom. And so we had this big movement of change that also busted, right? We had a bubble burst there. And so that's something that we have to keep in mind with Saturn and Aries. It can create change and movement that then might have to fall or burst or crash in some way, but it still is creating movements that are then going to continue to develop over time. We had the previous time with Saturn and Aries in the late 1960s, this time of great innovation, great change, great revolution, many protests happening. Again, this bending of reality happening. Although that late 60 period is often connected in with Pluto and Uranus being close together, the way things changed and started accelerating with change and rebellion and protests and new creative life and new movements, that does go with Saturn and Aries. If we go back to the late 1930s, we see another era of great disruption and great change that unfortunately correlated with the rise of fascism and many things that led into the Second World War. And if we go back to two other previous times, the 1908 to 1910 time period, as well as the 1878 to 1881 period, these have some technological innovations that I just think are worth mentioning. The Model T Ford, like that first birth of the automobile by Henry Ford, happened with Saturn in Aries in that 1908 to 1910 period. So we think about the power and change and the way collective reality started shifting with new movement, with that automobile, and the way we have all sorts of new transportation devices and inventions that are going to be coming in years ahead. I think we can see some relevance there. The one that I think is especially powerful, though, is the Saturn and Aries transit from 1878 to 1881, because it led into a Saturn and Neptune conjunction in Taurus in 1882. In that transit of Saturn and Aries from 1878 to 1881, Thomas Edison got a patent for his incandescent light bulb, and he successfully demonstrated it to the public for the first time. But by the time we then got to that Saturn and Neptune conjunction that happened in Taurus after Saturn left Aries, Edison and his electrical power company was able to light up an entire city block with electricity, and we get what is called the dawning of the electrical era in with that 1882 conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in Taurus. And so although that one was not in Aries, a lot of the developments with electricity were continuing to develop with the transit of Saturn in Aries. This dawning of the electrical age and streetlights that came with the movement of Saturn through Aries into the conjunction with Neptune in Taurus in 1882 is exactly what I'm talking about when I speak of how collective reality can change in such radical, dramatic ways when Saturn and Neptune come together. It's hard for us to imagine now what things were like back then before electricity, but there was such a powerful change on the way we think, on the way we are able to imagine and create our relationship with the night and darkness and our own inner life that was forever changed by electricity and by having lights on around us whenever we want. Now, of course, there are many benefits that have come with this, but I'm just speaking about the way this really made a dramatic change in the way we perceive reality and experience reality. And so this is exactly what can happen in these Saturn and Neptune time periods. And so with that conjunction of Saturn and Neptune in the first degree of Aries in February 2026, we can expect extraordinary changes in ways that are difficult to fully predict. And we know that since they're going to come together so closely in July of 2025, a lot is going to be developing and changing in the months ahead. If you would like to take a look at your astrology chart and how you will be in relationship with these great changes, my books are open for astrology consultations right now. I'm going to put a link below in the description so that you can book a session with me. I'm also going to put a link below to my Patreon. I have a Patreon community where I share extra information, such as videos that I don't post here on YouTube. You can also get discounts on consultations with me periodically, as well as by signing up for my Patreon. In addition to the lower tier of joining my Patreon, there are two higher tiers, each of which has a monthly meeting and class. On the higher tier, the oak tier, for the past couple of years, we've been having monthly classes exploring the meaning of different fixed stars, which has been really exciting and fun. And so please check out my Patreon if you'd like to learn more and join. Also, if you have not yet liked and subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do. It really helps me out. We are entering a period of extraordinary change, and I appreciate you spending the time with me exploring the possibilities of meaning. I'll see you next time.